Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 5 of a 7-part series entitled Heavy Music Visionaries, Inventors, Innovators, and Followers. And in this particular episode, I'm going to concentrate more on the followers, right? Throughout this series, I've spent a lot of time defining and giving examples of the inventors of heavy metal, the innovators in hard rock and heavy metal as well, the subgenres of metal and how those were key innovations on the original heavy metal invention, right? But in this episode, we're going to concentrate maybe a little bit at the other end of the spectrum. All right. So if you'd rather just read the text version of this essay, the link is provided below. Otherwise, follow me on. Here we are sharing our screen. Okay. So there is no shame in following greatness. All right. For starters, I believe heavy metal and portions of hard rock as well for that matter, but I believe heavy metal to be one of the most fearless forms of music in terms of the number of artists who challenge listeners and push the envelope, right? Often at the expense of wide commercial appeal, right? There's obviously a lot of metal bands that are clearly not in it for the money because the sounds they're generated are completely alien to the mainstream, and they're certainly not going to make a lot of money doing it. They're doing it purely for the art, right? So you really got to tip your hat to those folks. Indeed, since the invention of heavy metal by a consortium of artists in the late 60s and early 70s, so I talk about that a lot in part 2 and part 3 of this series, the art form continues to evolve into many interesting subgenres fueled by many innovative writers and players. Okay, and see part 4 of this series if you want more information on the subgenres and why I believe these are key innovations on the original heavy metal invention. All right. Having said all that, not every band in a given subclass, whether it be thrash metal, doom metal, black metal, on it goes, is particularly innovative. A lot of them are, and certainly I highlight those, right? But lots of them aren't. Heavy music has always had its share of followers who really did not add anything to the book of metal, so to speak, right? Yet, if the compositions and performances are done really well, there is certainly room for followers, at least to me there are, particularly if they reiterate something great. Okay, so a couple examples to tell you what I mean as far as followers are concerned. For example, I think Chicago doom metal band Trouble was, or perhaps is, pending some type of reformation, a first-rate band, and I enjoy their music very much. I think they're an awesome band. I've been listening to them since day one, and I still go back to their albums and think they're absolutely terrific. Yet in terms of their 1980s output with Eric Wagner at the mic, I hear almost no variation in style that significantly differentiates them from metal co-inventors Black Sabbath, right? Remember, I believe Black Sabbath to be a key co-inventor, but they were one of many, along with Deep Purple and Uriah Heep and Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, of course, and Cream, and the list goes on and on. But in this case, Trouble is clearly following the lead of Black Sabbath. And especially noteworthy on their first 3 albums, Psalm 9 of 1984, then 2 more albums released soon after, The Skull and Run to the Light. Trouble offers a bunch of fine songs that sound like something Ozzy-era Black Sabbath could have written. And given the similarity of some of the riffs sort of did right, I say somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Let's look at Trouble's discography a little bit here. It's not a particularly long one. Trouble only has 8 studio albums. I'm not counting. There's a couple live albums kicking around, and there's an unplugged album, probably a compilation somewhere as well. But if we look at their first 3 albums, Psalm 9, The Skull, and Run to the Light, they're absolutely dead ringers for Black Sabbath. They have two guitarists in the band, but both of them play just very similarly to Tony Iommi. The guitar tone's a dead ringer for Iommi. The pace of the music is typically slow and heavy. Once in a while, it gets rocking, like Sabbath did, right? Like Black Sabbath were always masters of lots of time changes and lots of different parts in each song, and from song to song it would change. Trouble does all of that. Eric Wagner, their vocalist for the majority of their albums, sings very Ozzy-like, I would say. Even the subject matter, which is, now this is, a little controversial, I suppose, for some folks, but Trouble was dubbed, especially when they first came out, as a Christian metal band, or sometimes referred to as white metal. And it was controversial in the sense because the band kind of backed away from that. They never really said they were. It's just something the press caught on with. But having said that, I mean, it's a moniker that really wasn't without justification. On the back of their albums, there are quotes from the Bible. Their lyrics are clearly sort of God-fearing, if you like. And as far as I'm concerned, that really is also a strong similarity with the vibe of Black Sabbath, especially the 70s Ozzy era Black Sabbath. Not so much Dio, that was a little bit different vibe. I think back, and lots of people would certainly never agree with this. The reputation of Black Sabbath is that they're just the opposite. They're this evil, heavy band. But in reality, if people would take time to actually read the lyrics, I'm reminded of what the famous writer Lester Baines back in the early 70s said about Black Sabbath. He was a famous writer for Cream magazine. And again, he was half kidding, but actually quite serious when he said that Black Sabbath was the first Christian hard rock band. And that's not far off the truth. Black Sabbath often talked about heaven and hell and paying for sins and etc. Yeah, they talked about Satan and the devil quite a bit in their music, especially some of the early albums, but never in a positive way, much like Trouble was doing, right? Basically, Sabbath was a warning. They would warn people, well, your wicked behavior, well, you're going to end up in a place you don't want to be, kind of thing, right? So anyway, that to me was always another similarity that Trouble really picked up on, right? The Christian overtones of sort of being a warning for bad behavior, if you like, right? Okay, so by the time we get to 1990, Trouble's self-titled album, another great album. They're all great albums, frankly. There's still a really heavy Sabbath vibe to what's going on, although admittedly, the songs are a little shorter, so they're sort of streamlining the approach a little bit. But the guitar tones, the soloing approach, guitar solo approach, Eric's vocal approach, all of that still reign very much like Sabbath, still really heavy as well. The last few albums, Manic Frustration, Plastic Greenhead, and then sort of a reformed album, Simple Mind Condition. Some people will say, and I've read this about Trouble a few times, that this is where they shift into more stoner metal away from doom metal. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. The song structures, again, are a little shorter. But whether it's stoner metal or doom metal, I mean, that's still coming out of Black Sabbath, right? So I'm still hearing a very heavy Black Sabbath vibe in what they did. Even on the distortion field, I think they're following the same trajectory, really. Although they have a different vocalist, Kyle Thomas, at the mic on that, right? So that's a quick overview of Trouble. Right, so again, I hear Trouble as a fantastic band, but very much followers of Black Sabbath in this case. I actually feel the same way about new wave of British heavy metal band Witchfinder General, another awesome band, right? Witchfinder General has a very short career, at least, well, they did a bit of a reformation later on, but basically they're known for two really storming albums, Death Penalty and Friends of Hell, released in 82 and in 83, part of the new wave of British heavy metal. Again, the guitar tones are just absolutely Iommi, bang, the drumming style. Their vocalist, Zee Parks, who's kind of a mysterious dude, kind of fell off the face of the earth after that second album. Again, absolute dead ringer for Ozzy. The subject matter, okay, there's a bit of a departure there. Witchfinder General, probably a little more evil, I guess, than Sabbath, but they still dealt in the warning sort of approach in their lyrics often. I have similar thoughts regarding Swedish Doom Titans Candlemass and California's simplified Downer Blaster Saint Vitus. Again, very much following the Black Sabbath blueprint. Again, love both of these bands, but I hear them both as followers, that they're not really innovative. Little more separated from Sabbath in a couple respects, I guess. Candlemass, especially when Messiah Marcohen was their vocalist, because he sang in a very, very operatic kind of style. Actually, a little more like Dio than Ozzy, so there's still a Sabbath link there, I would say. But their masterpieces, Nightfall, Ancient Dreams, and Tales of Creation, which are albums 2, 3, and 4, where Messiah really shines as a vocalist. But musically, they're basically textbook Black Sabbath. Heavy tones, basically doom metal, a little more epic, I guess you could say, than Black Sabbath in some cases, but still very, very much in the Sabbath blueprint. And so was Saint Vitus. By the way, Candlemass continues to record today, and they continue to be worth listening to. They've had lots of different vocalists, but every Candlemass album is terrific as far as I'm concerned. Saint Vitus, also still going today. Probably the only difference between Saint Vitus and Black Sabbath would be in the guitar solos, because the riffs are a simplified version of Sabbath, but Sabbath to the bone, basically. The pace of the music, totally Sabbath. Their original vocalist, Scott Riegers, again, a little more dramatic version of Ozzy, but lots of Ozzy-isms, I would say. The guitar solos, though, are a little different. David Chandler, great, really interesting guitar player. His solos, well, let's put it this way. Chandler plays as much his amp as he does his guitar, because his solos are really about controlling feedback, really. So a lot of cases, he's not playing distinct notes per se as much as he's controlling feedback. It's a really interesting concept he's got going. So there, he doesn't sound like Iommi at all. But outside the guitar solos, the riffs, etc., he channels Iommi almost directly, right? But overall, again, very much following the Sabbath path. So make no mistake, and again, I want to emphasize this because I don't want this to sound like a put down in a lot of ways, because these are some of my all-time favorite bands within doom metal. Trouble, Candlemass, Saint Vitus, love those bands, play them all the time. But I would be disingenuous if I were to proclaim that anything significantly new is going on here, because it just isn't, right? In essence, these are artists who have made a career of closely following a monumental roadmap forged by an incredibly influential co-inventor, in this case, Black Sabbath. And in so doing, have achieved intriguing results, right? At least that's how I'm hearing this, right? Incidentally, I would argue that there are far more followers in hard rock compared to metal, and that pop music is pretty much nothing but followers. That's a discussion for another day, so I'll leave it at that. But that's, generally speaking, I think heavy metal has a much higher proportion of innovators than most other forms of music, at least the forms of music I understand, right? But again, pop music, to me, it's all about following, or you're almost not popular, right? Anyway, talk about that another time, maybe. Okay, fresh sounds through amalgamation. All right, amongst the innovators and followers coexisting within the labyrinth of heavy metal subcategories, there is an intermediate class of artists that may be aptly called the amalgamators, or at least I'm calling them that. I don't know if that, I wouldn't say that's an official designation in any way, but I'm sort of calling them that anyway. And what I mean by the amalgamators, since little substance is added to the original heavy metal invention of 1960, late 60s, early 70s, these are not truly innovators. Okay, so again, I'm arguing the only inventors we truly have of heavy metal are the ones that co-invented heavy metal in the late 60s, early 70s. Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, Mountain, Blue Cheer, on it goes. So again, see part 3 if you want more information on that. Since then, everybody in heavy metal, whether you're in doom metal, black metal, power metal, thrash metal, death metal, funk metal, whatever, you're not an inventor, but you may well be a key innovator, i.e., you haven't produced something truly new, but you've made something significantly different on the original blueprint, right? And what I'm arguing is the followers in the amalgamators are neither. They're not one of the original inventors, and they're not one of the more recent innovators, okay? So in the case of the amalgamator, I'm saying that the primary goal here, at least seemingly, whether deliberately calculated or through some type of immersion, is to combine characteristics of typically highly innovative bands and come up with a sound that is basically some sort of sum total hybrid, if you like, right? So an amalgamator, so a follower will basically, take one band and basically sort of, redo, perhaps in an interesting way, what they've done, right? Whereas an amalgamator will take key aspects of more than one band and sort of put them together in sort of a repackaged way, is sort of what I'm saying. But in essence, still not really doing anything new. Okay? So that's sort of the distinction I'm making there. So the stylistic connectiveness between innovators Slayer and Pantera, right? So I would argue Slayer and Pantera they're not inventors, because that only occurred once in the late 60s and early 70s with a bunch of co-inventors. But they are absolutely innovators. They're absolutely pushing heavy music forward. Slayer did it in thrash, and Pantera did it in power metal, I would argue, right? So Lamb of God, to me, is a great example of an amalgamator, taking aspects of Pantera and Slayer, as well as other aspects, which I'll get to, and repackaging them into sort of a new form, if you like, right? Or an additional form, not truly new, an additional form. Okay, so we're going to look at that example, Slayer and Pantera as innovators, and what I'll do is we'll talk about both of those bands briefly, but especially their key aspects, particularly their innovative aspects, and how Lamb of God sort of brought that into their sound. All right, all three amazing bands. Okay, all right, so Slayer. Few would dispute the importance of Slayer to heavy metal. Again, whether you like them or not, it's another story, but you can't, I think it's impossible to say that Slayer didn't have an impact on heavy metal. All right. Although all their early material can be viewed as influential, it's the third album, Rain and Blood, released in 1986, that was an absolute game changer and is, for many metal fans, the ultimate statement in thrash metal. Again, was it the greatest thrash metal album of all time? I happen to think it was, but certainly it gets talked about in the same breath as, say, Metallica's Master of Puppets, maybe even Ride the Lightning. You often hear those as the most important thrash albums of all time. Exodus's first album, Bonded by Blood, is usually put in that list. Megadeth, of course. Probably their second album, Peace Sells But Who's Buying, or maybe the fourth album, Rust in Peace, gets listed a lot. Anthrax is Amongst the Living, their third album. That's often talked about in there. But in my mind, every one of those albums are absolutely essential. Beautiful albums to listen to. Can't get enough of them. But to me, they got nothing on Rain and Blood. Rain and Blood is the numero uno in my mind. Okay. Slayer and thrash metal, and indeed almost, Rain and Blood is one of my favorite heavy metal albums by anybody, but in thrash metal, yeah, it's the king, in my view. But certainly those others I listed too are rightfully considered up there as well. Okay. After Rain and Blood, Slayer continued to be an innovative force throughout their next 4 discs. So South of Heaven in 88, Seasons in the Abyss in 1990, Divine Intervention in 94, and then Diablos and Musica in 1998. Since then, Slayer's the albums released towards the end of Slayer's career, admittedly were a little more of a retread. So I'm arguing it's those 4 albums where Slayer was truly at their most innovative. And we'll look at that in a slightly different format. And I'm going to do that for Pantera and Lamb of God, so you can kind of see how all this sort of fits together, right? So here we have Slayer. Here's their discography. Again, considering just studio albums, not covers albums and live albums and stuff like that. Lots of them are really great too. But here I'm just looking specifically at studio albums. So their first two albums, Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits, great albums. Like I think they're important albums for sure. But really, it's at Rain and Blood where Slayer really finds their sound and is at their most innovative. And I think their innovative period continues into the next four albums. So 5 albums in total, right? Diablos and Musica, for some people, although I think that's an incredibly innovative album, for some Slayer fans, they kind of went a little too far. That album is a little, it's not as well received, I think, as some of their others. These albums since Diablos, I think are all great albums, and I think if you're a Slayer fan, you need to have them, absolutely. But if I'm being honest here, I don't think they're doing anything really new. They're just redoing what they've done before. Still really interesting, great. The playing's incredible, the performances are amazing, right? But I don't think they're necessarily innovative anymore. I think this is when the band was at their most innovative, and these are some of the ideas that I think go into Lamb of God, which I'll get to. Okay, Slayer retires. They toured for a couple years after Repentless, so I'm going to say Slayer's been retired for maybe 3 or 4 years now. And of course, original guitarist Jeff Hanneman's been passed away for some time. So, Dave Lombardo, the original drummer of Slayer, has been all kinds of projects, so he's still a going concern. Tom Araya, I don't think's done anything. Kerry King, the other guitar player in Slayer, has been threatening for years to put a new band together, which he says will be very Slayer-like. So I'm assuming something there will happen at some point, but nothing yet. Anyway, so that's Slayer. Okay, so some of the most innovative aspects of Slayer that we should mention, and then we can kind of attach them to Lamb of God. Okay. Many things distinguish Slayer, but arguably their most innovative aspects centered around great riffs that were equal measure heavy, fast, and memorable. And maybe the memorable is the most important thing, because at the end of the day, every heavy metal band has riffs, right? In fact, that's the building blocks of the songs. That's in a lot of ways what makes heavy metal is riffs. But Slayer had this uncanny way of writing riffs that just stuck in your head, right? Which again is not an easy thing to do when you consider all the riffs out there, right? I'm not saying every song they wrote was memorable, but they seem to have more than their fair share of key memorable riffs, right? Fast, heavy, but still, and sometimes quite complicated, but they stuck in your head, right? So great riffs was a big part of their innovation. Guitar solos that reached the pinnacle in hysteric belligerence. In part 4, I talk about Slayer's approach to guitar solos, whether it be Kerry King or Jeff Hanneman, or later even Jeff Holt, or not Jeff Holt. Okay, that'll come to me anyway. They had almost a jazz-like approach to their soloing, right? That the solos seemed to be just chaotic sounds coming out of everywhere, but they still made sense, right? So that's sort of what I mean by the pinnacle in hysteric belligerence. And drumming that not only propels songs as aggressively as possible, but never forsakes catchy rhythms and, dare I say, grooves. So as heavy and as fast as Slayer was, they also had some groove to them, right? Gary Holt, sorry, also Access guitars. That's going to bug me until I got it out of me. Sorry about that. And drumming that not only propels songs as aggressively as possible, but never forsakes catchy rhythms and, dare I say, groove, right? So Dave Lombardo was Slayer's original drummer, widely considered one of the greatest drummers in thrash for good reason. Technically flawless. The guy was just a powerhouse drummer, but as heavy as he played, he always had this groove to it as well. As did Paul Bostaph, who replaced Lombardo, and he's just about every bit as good as Lombardo was. Anyway, Slayer achieved much notoriety over dark lyrics that initially were overtly satanic and then more serial killer obsessed, right? So obviously Slayer always dealt with the dark side. But few took this component of their art seriously, which I never did, and I don't think anybody should. Slayer was always lyrically the equivalent of watching a horror show, really, a serial killer horror show or something, right? Okay, that's how I always saw them anyway, so you don't take it seriously. All right. Okay. Moving on to Pantera. So Slayer, a key, absolutely key innovator within the thrash metal subgenre. All right. And we've just sort of listed, so I've highlighted when in their career they were at their most innovative and what were some of the most innovative characteristics of their sound. I'll do the same thing for Pantera. Pantera's beginnings were much more humble and even somewhat hair metalish at times. I'm kind of sad to report. But nevertheless, once they got going, they really got going. Once their fifth and particularly their sixth albums were released, Cowboys from Hell in 1990 and Vulgar Display of Power in 1992, they became the undisputed leaders in the American power metal movement. A crown they never relinquished throughout their remaining tenure, throughout three more landmark albums, Far Beyond Driven, The Great Southern Trendkill, and Reinventing the Steel. So let's have a quick look at Pantera. And then again, we'll link it with Lamb of God in a second here. So here's Pantera's discography. As you can see, it's their last five albums that I'm designating when they were at their most innovative, and we'll talk about what those characteristics were in a second. Pantera's beginnings were pretty humble. In fact, I'm not even sure Pantera was particularly proud of some of their early albums because some of this stuff is still out of print. Like, you still can't even get this stuff. As big a band as Pantera were and kind of are, I don't want to say they've reformed, but they are touring as Pantera right now. But nevertheless, they start off very humbly. And power metal, okay, that's maybe approaching the Pantera we know, but really it's Cowboys from Hell and especially Vulgar Display of Power where we get the true Pantera sound. And that continues with Far Beyond Driven. For as heavy as it was, an incredibly big selling album, actually. The Great Southern Trendkill, the band maybe become a little more varied, but there's still the trademark Pantera sound, the power metal sound you just can't miss. And then they go out on top with Reinventing the Steel, and also a really good album. A lot of this shift had to do with the inclusion of vocalist Phil Ensemble, who wasn't on their earlier albums. Oh, he was on power metal, but not the early one. So that had something to do with the shift as well, right? And then, as I was mentioning, Pantera just in 2022. Of course, they can't reform because sadly, the guitarist Dimebag Darrell passed away a number of years ago. He was actually shot on stage, which a lot of people probably know about that tragedy. And then his brother Vinnie Paul, drummer, passed away a few years ago as well, right? So obviously they're not involved. But Charlie Benante from Anthrax is on drums, and Zach Wilde is playing guitar. Zach was actually a great friend of Dimebag, so it sort of makes sense. And Zach is no slouch himself, and he's an over-the-top guitar player, so the fit is actually quite a good one. It's controversial, though. There are people out there who don't think they should be touring as Pantera. I mean, Phil Ensemble is still the vocalist, right? So he's still there, etc. But I'm okay with it. It is what it is. You know, they're not saying they're Pantera reform because that's impossible. But they're allowing, you know, people who never saw them before to see these songs, these amazing songs from this era, right? Played again. They don't do anything early, of course, from that era being played. So I think it's great. Rex Brown, the original bass player's involved as well. So, you know, it's cool for what it is. Anyway. Going back to looking at some of Pantera's distinguishing features, I would say Pantera's two most recognizable attributes had to be Dimebag Darrell's over-the-top guitar heroics. Dime was really an interesting player. I think it's fair to say, and I've seen this quote more than a few times. He's sort of a full-on heavy metal version of Eddie Van Halen. Lots of whammy bar gymnastics, lots of squeals and all kinds of guitar effects going on, right? But just a much heavier version of Eddie sort of thing. I'm not saying better because that's impossible, but very much in the Eddie Van Halen mode. I know Eddie Van Halen, he was a big hero. He loved Ace Frehley from Kiss, by the way, too. I think those might be his two big guys. I'm talking about Dimebag's big influences. But yeah, so, you know, certainly Dime's tone and over-the-top playing was a big feature. I mean, his riffs, his solos, all that stuff of Pantera. But probably the second most recognizable feature of Pantera had to be Philip Anselmo's vocal roar, and indeed his lyrics as well, but especially his vocals that never disintegrated into death metal tone. So he never did the death metal growl or anything, but in a lot of ways was just as extreme, right? I mean, it was such a raspy, forceful kind of vocal approach, kind of a little more like a Lemmy, only more forceful, that he actually came across as very, very extreme and violent in his vocal approach, right? Really a terrific frontman as well. Okay, so both Slayer and Pantera were amongst the most innovative bands of their eras and supplemented the initial invention of heavy metal in immeasurable ways, right? So neither invented metal. They're not, because again, as I say, that only happened in the late 60s, early 70s with a bunch of co-inventors, but they were big in the innovators that they really added to the heavy metal blueprint in their own way, right? Pantera and power metal, Slayer and thrash metal. In contrast, one of their notable offsprings, if I can put it that way, Lamb of God, achieved nothing of the kind. They obviously weren't inventors because that only happened once at one point in time anyway. And I would argue they're not particularly innovative either. But they're still a great band. Okay, so let me talk about Lamb of God here a little bit. Lamb of God's career begins during Pantera's twilight years, not counting the reformation, although Lamb of God is still going, by the way. But you know, Pantera's initial run. So their career begins in Pantera's twilight years and after Slayer's True Glory era, right? Which I would argue ends somewhere around Diablos and Musica in 1998, right? So that's around the time where Lamb of God is starting to get going. Really, Lamb of God's second album, or technically, I guess their third album, if you count Burn the Priest, which was the name of the band before they became Lamb of God. They released one album, but they still were basically Lamb of God at that point. But really, it's the third album, As the Palace Burns, that was released in 2003, that is widely considered their true coming out party. And it's unquestionably when their core sound is established. Okay. From there, they went on to record a number of extremely well-received albums, a lot of great albums, including Ashes of the Wake, Sacrament, and Wrath. Probably my all-time, one of my favorites would be Wrath. My all-time favorite I'll get to in a second because it's a little bit interesting, I think. But those albums and others, and rightfully remain one of the most revered metal acts today. Okay, so going to Lamb of God and sort of fitting this together a little bit. Right, so here's Lamb of God. As I said, it's As the Palaces Burn, where most people say, okay, this is where Lamb of God really has their core sound. This is when we really hear what the band's about. And I think that's true because this album has been pretty much the blueprint for everything that follows forward as far as Lamb of God's concerned. And like I say, they've released a lot of great albums. Sacrament, Wrath, I really love. The latest album, Omens, I think is terrific as well. So they continue to, the self-titled one of 2020 is excellent. They're all really good albums. But probably somewhat paradoxically, my all-time favorite album by Lamb of God would be New American Gospel. And to some degree, the reason I do like it the most is because it's before they really become big Slayer and Pantera amalgamators. They're kind of a little different at this point, right? A little more metalcore. Before metalcore became a big subgenre, they kind of, to me, were sort of leaders in the field, even with Burn the Priest. Like those first two albums, but especially a New American Gospel, I think they were kind of on to something new. And then in some ways, I would argue they kind of regress, even though these are amazing albums. It sounds like I'm contradicting myself. But they become more the followers, more the amalgamators here, but at the same time become incredibly popular doing it, right? And still put out great albums. So anyway, that's sort of, so I'm saying that Lamb of God, the bulk of their material, once they develop their core sound, is basically a sum total of the innovative era of Slayer, the innovative part of Pantera, plus something else, which I'll get to in just a second. Okay, so Lamb of God are master amalgamators. When I play any of their albums, I am certainly enjoying the experience, despite the fact that nothing really new is happening here. They are essentially a sum total of 1. Slayer, especially in the riffs. I'm not saying every Lamb of God is sort of based on a Slayer riff, and I'm also not saying they're taking Slayer riffs and ripping them off. I'm not saying that at all. But when you hear a lot of their riffs, they sound Slayer-like. Okay, they're not plagiarizing. I'm not saying that. Neither does Trouble plagiarize Black Sabbath, as far as I'm concerned. But the influence is strikingly strong. Let's put it that way. Okay, so to me, Lamb of God are a sum total of Slayer, especially in the riff department, Pantera, now especially in the vocal delivery. Randy Blythe, who I consider one of the best frontmen in metal today, has a very Phil Anselmo-like vocal delivery. I mean, again, he's a dead ringer for Phil. But he's still great, and he's still got his own vibe and all that, especially live, right? But his vocal delivery is very Phil-like. At least I certainly hear it. And I also hear the drumming in Lamb of God very much like Pantera as well, in style, right? But I think there's aspects of Pantera, there's aspects of Slayer, which I think are really highly integrated in the Lamb of God sound, especially after the third album or third album and forward. But also Lamb of God has a decidedly more general hardcore punk sort of angle to them as well, which actually is also part of Slayer's DNA. So that also sort of links them also with Slayer as well, right? But I think in Lamb of God's situation, it's a little more generic in terms of the hardcore punk connection, right? Okay, a couple other commonalities we can mention here too. Lamb of God's lyrics deal with the evils of the world, inner turmoil, raging rebellion, and an individual's need to own up to their own liabilities, right? Very much in keeping with the Pantera, i.e. Anselmo's philosophy, right? So lyrically too, when I'm listening to or reading Lamb of God's lyrics, they also remind me a lot of the stuff Pantera would go on about in their glory years as well. Throughout the catalog, it's evident that Lamb of God has made a conscious effort to keep guitar solos to a minimum, likely indicative of their hardcore ethic and trimming the fat. So here, there's a little bit of a departure. When we talk about Slayer and Pantera, I mean, there's a guitar solo in every song. Okay, don't quote me on that one. There's probably a song here or there that doesn't have one, but virtually every song, let's say 98% at least, right? I mean, it's just they're there, right? Whether it be Dimebag in Pantera or Hanneman and King or Holt in Slayer, there's guitar solos. That's just their thing. Lamb of God doesn't have guitar solos in all their songs, right? I mean, lots of them don't have guitar solos. Yet, when they do have breaks, the tone, effects, and whammy bar gymnastics in Lamb of God are really out of Dimebag's playbook, right? So they sound very Pantera-esque, at least to me. Maybe with a little less finesse, a little more brute force to them. But they sound, there's a real Pantera link there for me. Okay, so in fairness, though, I am generalizing to a point here about Lamb of God, right? There are examples of musical left turns in the moodier territories in their catalog. Gomorrah and September Song from the Omens album of 2022 would be two really good recent examples, right? And there'd be a few others in their catalog too, if I'm being fair, right? So I'm not saying every song is of this footprint, right? But I think it's also really fair to say Lamb of God rarely stray from their Slayer, Pantera, hardcore, agglomerative sound, and the metal public continues to reward them for it, right? And again, rightfully so. Lamb of God's a great band, right? So bottom line, some bands are particularly proficient at repackaging music in convincing and interesting ways, right? Only annoying the subset of heavy fans that just have time for the truly groundbreaking. So I know those folks are out there, right? The heavy fans that just want to listen to the inventors and the innovators. And the followers and the amalgamators like, I've heard it before, so I'm not interested, okay? I'm not that type of person, right? Yes, I'll admit, I probably am biased towards the inventors and innovators a little bit. I know I am. But I always got time for the followers or amalgamators, especially if they're really good players, right? Or if they're repackaging, they're doing it in interesting ways, right? So anyway, that's part 5. In part 6, we're actually going to spend a lot more time looking at the other side of the coin. So I've talked in this episode a lot about the followers and the amalgamators. In the next part, we're going to look at the bands in heavy music, or the artists that are really pushing things forward. You know, the really restless innovators, right? And as I'm going to argue, most of those are found or are associated with prog, okay? The biggest innovators in heavy music, and indeed some of the key inventors back in the day, are either progressive rock, prog metal, or if they are in another category, could be doom metal, black metal, thrash metal, whatever, they have strong progressive tendencies. Okay? So hopefully I'll see you in part 6, right? Well, actually, I'm not going to see anybody. Maybe you'll see me, this talking head, in part 6. Take care. Have a terrific day.